If you walk through central London today, the city doesn't just feel like a capital, it feels like a victory museum. Stone and bronze everywhere. Names carved into granite. Eternal flames. A figure of Winston Churchill staring down the street like he's still guarding it. The memorials all tell the same story: Britain held the line, endured the darkest hour, paid the price, and won. It's a beautiful story. It's also a convenient one. Because when a nation turns history into marble, it usually hides the invoices, too. In the popular version of World War II, Britain stands alone against a monstrous machine, burns through its last ounce of strength, and crawls across the finish line in 1945, broke but noble, poorer but righteous. And yes, rationing was real. The Blitz was real. The sacrifice was real. But here's the question the statues don't ask: if Britain was so broke, who kept paying the bills? Not just for bullets and ships, but for steel, fuel, rubber, food, the boring stuff that keeps armies moving. Modern war isn't only fought with courage. It's fought with balance sheets. There's another memory of this war that doesn't live in Trafalgar Square or on the steps of Parliament. You find it in places that rarely make the postcard: in Bengal, where rice vanished and prices exploded; in Cairo, where bitterness never quite faded. Across an empire that learned, the hard way, that victory can be financed like a magic trick. Because Britain didn't always pay in cash. Sometimes it paid in accounting. Sometimes it paid in promises. And sometimes, it didn't pay at all, at least not in any way the suppliers could use. This is the story hiding behind the monuments: how a war that looked like national sacrifice was also a massive transfer of cost, shifted outward. Away from London, onto the poorest subjects of Britain's empire. And the tool wasn't a secret weapon or a new tank. It was a currency system, an invisible chain that tied many countries to one city. A system called the sterling area, where London didn't just run an empire. It ran the money. That is where it begins. In the version most people grew up with, Britain's war story plays like a film you've seen 100 times, but it still hits every time. It's 1940. France falls. The maps turn dark. Across the Channel, the Nazi war machine looks unstoppable: tanks, planes, ships, factories running day and night. And Britain is just an island, small on the globe, exposed on the sea, waiting for the next wave to crash. So the story goes: Britain stands alone. No one else can save them. No one else will. The empire is stretched thin, the convoy routes are under attack, cities burn under nightly raids. Families sleep in underground stations. Children are shipped out to the countryside. Every light is blacked out, every window taped, every mouth trained to speak a little softer, because even sound feels dangerous. And yet the country doesn't break. Factories keep turning. Women step into jobs that used to be men's work. Bread is rationed. Fuel is rationed. Meat is rationed. People learn to make do, to repair, to reuse, to survive. The Air Force fights like it has nothing left to lose. Pilots climb into the sky knowing they might not come back, and the nation watches, breath held. As if the outcome of the world is balanced on a few thin wings. Then the war expands. North Africa. The Atlantic. Italy. Normandy. Britain becomes a fortress and a launchpad, a battered but unbroken anchor for the Allied push. And by 1945, the victory is framed as a kind of glorious bankruptcy: Britain wins, but the cost is everything. The country emerges exhausted, poorer, rationing still in place, its wealth spent to defeat a greater evil. That myth is powerful because it's not entirely false. Britain did suffer. Britain did fight. Britain did endure. But myths don't just tell you what happened. They tell you what to stop asking. Because if Britain truly emptied its pockets to pay for the war, why did so many people, far from London, remember paying too? Now cut away from London. Not to the beaches of Normandy, not to the skies over Kent, but to places that rarely appear in the official montage. Bengal, 1943. The air is thick, hot, and heavy with panic. In the markets, rice becomes a rumor. Prices jump, then jump again. A family that could afford food last month can't afford it this week. Wages don't keep up. People sell jewelry, tools, even cooking pots, anything for one more meal. And then, quietly, the streets begin to fill with bodies that look less like the aftermath of battle and more like the slow collapse of a society. Cairo, another kind of memory. Less visible, more political. The feeling that the empire's promises always come with fine print. That the war wasn't just fought for freedom, it was also fought to preserve a system where London decides who gets paid, who gets supplies, and who gets to tighten their belt. In these places, the story of World War II sounds different. It's not a tale of noble sacrifice that ended in honorable poverty. It's a story about extraction. About a bill that kept growing, and a hand that kept pushing it across the table. Because Britain didn't only fight the war with courage and steel. It fought with credit. When the cost of modern war started swallowing Britain's gold reserves, the empire didn't collapse. It adapted. It found a way to keep ordering ships, guns, food, cloth, rubber, everything a global war demands, without having the cash to pay like a normal customer. And the trick was brutally simple: Britain turned its colonies into lenders. Not voluntary investors. Not equal partners. Forced creditors. Goods and labor flowed outward: real rice, real steel, real uniforms, real human work. And in return, London issued something far lighter, an IOU, recorded in pounds, sitting safely in British accounts, money that existed on paper, but couldn't always be touched. So while Britain told itself it had gone broke for the world, another memory formed across the empire: Britain didn't go broke. Britain passed the pain down the chain. This is that hidden story, the one not carved into stone in London, but remembered in hunger, in resentment, and in numbers written in a ledger. To understand how Britain could shift a war's cost onto other people, you have to understand the machine that made it possible, an empire built not just on ships and soldiers, but on a currency rulebook. It was called the sterling area, and on paper it sounded almost harmless, a common monetary zone tied to the British pound. But in practice it worked like a financial leash. Across the empire, India, Malaya, parts of Africa, the Middle East, colonial governments and local administrations were pushed into the same arrangement: hold your reserves in pounds. Not in gold. Not in US dollars. Pounds. That meant the savings of huge territories, foreign exchange reserves, export earnings, national rainy day funds, were effectively parked in London. The Bank of England wasn't just Britain's central bank. It became the vault for an entire imperial economy. And with that came control. If you control where reserves sit, you control what they can be used for. You can decide when money moves, how fast, and under what conditions. You can set rules about conversion. You can block access. You can delay payments. You can turn a colony's assets into a line on your own balance sheet. The sterling area also shaped trade itself. When you're forced to hold pounds, you're nudged to buy from the pound world, to import from Britain or from partners approved by Britain. The system didn't only manage money. It managed dependency. This is what most people miss about empires: the real glue isn't always military power. It's the financial plumbing, the quiet rules that determine who holds what currency, who has access to hard assets, and who gets stuck with paper. So when war arrives and Britain's bills explode, the sterling area becomes more than a monetary club. It becomes a survival mechanism. Britain can pull resources from abroad, pay with bookkeeping entries, and keep the pound looking stable, because the demand for pounds is built into the system. The empire, in other words, isn't just sending troops. It's sending credit. And the key point is this: once your reserves live in London, London holds the key. Not just to your money, but to your future options. When the crisis hits, the question isn't, does Britain have cash? The question is, can Britain make everyone else finance the difference? In the sterling area, the answer was yes. By the early years of the war, Britain's problem wasn't bravery. It was math. Modern war is an industrial furnace. It eats steel by the ton, fuel by the ocean, rubber by the plantation, food by the convoy. Every day you keep a global army moving, you burn money, real money, at a speed no peacetime budget can survive. And Britain, for all its pride, was still a small island that imported much of what it needed to fight. At first, Britain paid the way any country pays in an emergency: it emptied the vault. Gold reserves were shipped out to cover purchases, especially from the United States, the world's industrial powerhouse. Britain needed American planes, machine tools, trucks, munitions, spare parts. And for a while, gold made the deal possible. But gold doesn't regenerate. It only drains. And the drain was faster than anyone wanted to admit. U-boats threatened shipping lanes, production needs kept rising, and every month the price tag of survival grew heavier. By 1941, the numbers stopped being uncomfortable and started being terrifying. Britain was running out of liquid cash. Not, we should tighten the belt, running out. We might not be able to pay for the war, running out. In financial terms, Britain was sliding towards something close to insolvency, unable to keep buying what it needed on normal terms. Now here's the trap: Britain couldn't simply demand the United States hand over supplies for free. Washington had its own politics, its own interests, its own limits. Even with sympathy, America wasn't going to bankroll Britain indefinitely without conditions. So in London, the search for a way out began, quietly, urgently. And with the kind of cold realism that only appears when a great power feels the ground moving beneath it. If Britain couldn't print dollars, and couldn't conjure more gold, it needed another source of financing. Another pool of real resources. Another way to keep ordering what it needed without actually paying in hard currency. And that's when the empire stopped being just a map of territories. It became a balance sheet. Because unlike the United States, Britain had leverage over its colonies that was far more direct. It could command production. It could set rules. It could decide how the money system worked. And it could do something no normal borrower can do: force other people to lend. In 1941, that wasn't a theory. It was Britain's lifeline. If Britain was the command center of the empire, then India was the engine room, and in 1941, it became something else too. It became the empire's ATM. India wasn't only a source of troops. It was a manufacturing base that could produce uniforms, cloth, steel, boots, grain, and the raw materials that a mechanized war devours. Britain needed those goods to sustain campaigns in North Africa and the Middle East, to keep supply lines alive, to keep soldiers fed and equipped. But here was the catch: Britain didn't have the hard currency to pay for all of it. So London built a system that looked legal, tidy, almost civilized, because on paper, it was just accounting. Here's how the IOU machine worked. When the British war effort needed goods from India, the orders were placed through the colonial administration. Indian producers delivered real output: rice, textiles, steel, services, things you can touch, store, ship, and consume. They got paid in rupees. The local government in India paid them using the domestic currency, which meant expanding the money supply, printing more rupees, issuing more credit, pushing more cash into circulation. To the factory owner or farmer, it felt like a normal transaction: you sell, you get paid. But Britain didn't reimburse India in rupees. Britain didn't ship gold back. Britain didn't hand over dollars. Instead, London performed a single, elegant move. It made a ledger entry. At the Bank of England, Britain credited an account in India's name with an equivalent amount, denominated in pounds sterling. On the books, it looked like India was accumulating wealth in London. Like a savings account growing larger with every shipment, every contract, every ton of grain. Those entries became known as sterling balances, a name so gentle it almost sounds like good news. And in theory, it was. In theory, India was now a creditor. Britain was the debtor. The empire, supposedly, was simply trading within itself. But here's the detail that changes everything: India wasn't an independent country making free financial choices. The key decisions, what could be purchased, what could be converted, when money could move, were ultimately controlled by London. So Britain was effectively using a gigantic credit card to fund the war, except the card wasn't in Britain's name. It was in India's. India paid out rupees inside its own economy to deliver goods to Britain's war machine. Britain paid back with pounds trapped in London, numbers in an account that India could see, but not always use. The empire had found a way to keep buying real resources with something lighter than money, with permission, paperwork, and power. And once that machine was running, every new shipment didn't just feed the war. It increased the debt, quietly, relentlessly, written in pounds, sitting in London, waiting for the day someone would ask to cash it in. By the time the war ended, the numbers were staggering. India's sterling balances, those savings sitting in London, had climbed to around £1.3 billion. In today's terms, that would translate into hundreds of billions of dollars in purchasing power. On a spreadsheet, it made India look like a creditor nation and Britain look like the one in debt. But the moment India tried to treat those balances like real money, the illusion cracked. Because Britain didn't just owe India pounds. Britain controlled the pounds. London announced that the sterling balances were effectively frozen. Not erased, not formally defaulted on, but locked behind rules that made them unusable. India couldn't simply withdraw the money and spend it. It couldn't convert those pounds into US dollars to buy American machinery. It couldn't shift them into gold. It couldn't freely shop on the world market for what an exhausted, post-war economy desperately needed. The asset existed, but it couldn't move. Imagine being told you're wealthy, shown your account statement, watching the number sit there like a mountain, only to find out you can't touch it. Can't transfer it, can't exchange it for anything that matters. It's money in theory, but not in practice. A promise that only the promiser gets to interpret. And that's what made the system feel, to many Indians, like a legal theft. Britain had taken real things, grain, steel, cloth, labor, production capacity, at the moment they were most valuable. Those goods had fed armies, powered campaigns, stabilized Britain's war effort. And in return, India received an IOU that Britain could delay, restrict, and reshape whenever it wanted. The trap was even deeper because of what had happened inside India during the war. To pay producers, the colonial government had expanded rupee issuance. More money circulated at home. But many of the goods that money could buy had been redirected outward to the war effort. So India ended up with the worst combination, more currency chasing fewer goods, while its foreign reserves sat immobilized in London. The sterling balance wasn't just a frozen account. It was a pressure chamber. And the genius of it, from Britain's perspective, was that it avoided the one thing that would have caused immediate political and financial catastrophe, an open default. Britain could say, we're not refusing to pay. Britain could point to the ledger and say, look, the balances are there. But if the balances can't be converted, can't be accessed, can't buy hard assets, then what are they? They're leverage. They're a way to keep the empire's former subjects holding the pound, dependent on British permission, waiting for releases that come slowly. Under conditions, on a schedule set in London. A debt written in ink, made powerless by policy. And that's when the war moved to a new battlefield, not the skies or the beaches, but the rules of money itself. Here's the brutal truth about the sterling balance system: the ledger entries were quiet, but the consequences were loud. When Britain ordered supplies from India, India paid its producers in rupees, new rupees, created to keep the wartime machine running. That meant more cash in people's hands: farmers, transporters, mill workers, merchants. In a normal economy, more money might mean more demand and more production. But wartime India wasn't normal. Because at the same time that rupees multiplied, goods were leaving. Grain was diverted. Cloth was shipped out. Logistics were redirected toward military priorities. What remained in local markets shrank, even as the amount of money chasing those goods grew. Too much money. Too little food. And that's how inflation becomes a weapon without anyone calling it one. Rice prices started to climb, and then they stopped behaving like prices at all. They became a runaway train. A family that had survived on thin margins suddenly found that an entire day's wages wouldn't buy a single meal. People weren't starving because the earth produced nothing. They were starving because they were priced out of life. That difference matters. Starvation isn't always the absence of food. Sometimes it's the collapse of access. In Bengal, 1943, that collapse turned into catastrophe. Markets emptied. Hoarding spread. Speculation flourished. Panic became policy. And Britain's wartime purchasing pushed harder. The government bought up rice aggressively, partly to feed troops, partly to ship supplies across the empire, including to the Middle East. Every purchase made sense inside Britain's war logic. Every purchase also tightened the noose at home. This is where the story becomes hard to tell without feeling sick. Because the famine was not a distant, abstract event. It was bodies on sidewalks. It was villages hollowed out. It was mothers walking miles with children who stopped crying because they no longer had the strength. It was people collapsing not in battle, but in silence. And as this happened, the accounting machine kept running. Every real bag of rice removed from a starving region added another line of value to India's sterling balances in London. Numbers went up at the same time lives went down. A mountain of credit building inside the Bank of England formed alongside hunger in Bengal. Some British officials knew exactly what was happening. Reports were sent. Warnings were written. The suffering was visible to anyone willing to look. But the war had its own hierarchy of priorities, and in London the priority was simple: defeat Hitler, hold the empire, keep the system intact. This is the moral shock at the center of the story. A financial mechanism designed to solve Britain's cash crisis helped create conditions where millions of people were pushed beyond the edge. Not because food did not exist, but because the rules of money and power determined who could claim it. The famine wasn't just tragedy. It was the human bill, paid in the one currency no ledger records: lives. When the shooting stopped in 1945, Britain celebrated victory, then immediately ran into the hangover. Because the war hadn't only destroyed cities and burned supplies. It had also left Britain with a mountain of debt, especially to the very places it had been ordering from for years. India, Egypt, and other parts of the empire looked at their sterling balances and thought the same thing: now you pay. For India, the timing was everything. Independence was near. A new country needed capital, machinery, power plants, schools, rails, factories. The sterling balances looked like a starter fund for national development, money earned through sacrifice, shortages, and forced contribution during wartime. But London saw the problem differently. If Britain released those balances quickly, if pounds flooded out of London and got converted into dollars and hard assets, the pound could crash. Britain's imports would become unaffordable. Its fragile recovery could stall. And worst of all, the world might decide the pound was no longer trustworthy. So Britain searched for a way to do something delicate and dangerous. Default, without admitting it was default. The solution was delay dressed up as responsibility. Britain kept the balances frozen, then allowed access only in small, controlled amounts, little releases, spread over years. With restrictions and conditions. Enough to claim progress. Never enough to transform an economy. On paper, the debt remained. In real life, the value began to die. Then came the next move, 1949. Britain devalued the pound by about 30% against the US dollar. For Britain, it was framed as a painful but necessary step to boost exports and stabilize the economy. For India and other holders of sterling, it was instant damage, like waking up to find a third of your savings evaporated overnight. And the erosion didn't stop there. Even when limited withdrawals were allowed, the returns were low and the rules were tight. While inflation in Britain kept eating away at purchasing power year after year, time itself became a tool. The longer the balances sat, the less they were worth. So Britain didn't need to tear up the IOUs. It didn't need a dramatic declaration. It only needed control over the pace, the terms, and the value of the currency in which the debt was written. That's the genius, and the cruelty, of default without saying default. The war ended in 1945. But for the former colonies, the financial battle had only begun. Empires aren't held together by flags alone. Sometimes they're held together by currency, by who controls the vault, the exchange rate, and the rules of access. The sterling trap shows how power can move wealth without firing a shot, a signature, a freeze, a devaluation, and entire societies pay the price. So here's the question the monuments don't ask: who really financed victory in World War II? If you want more stories where history is explained through money and power, subscribe ***, and tell me in the comments. What other heroic narratives deserve a second ledger?